what she did, and she got over some of her fear about that. And next thing you know, she was getting arrested with other suffragettes, and she was arrested and imprisoned 3 times while she was during her British stay. Um, and at least one of those times, she followed the suffragette call to, while in jail, at a certain point is reached, to then do hunger strike. And so she joined the others with hunger strike, and because that was actually, if the women for prolonged periods were in jail and not eating, of course they would die, and that was something the British government wouldn't put up with. They didn't want to let the women go, and so they force-fed the women. And so that was Alice Paul's experience, with a tube being forced down her throat against her will, and raw eggs and some kind of concoction being dumped down into her stomach in that way. Very, very, very hard on her physically, and very painful. And of course, uh, uh, an attack really on her personhood. But she tried that and realized that it was, in the British context anyway, being very effective, because people were saying, wow, if women who we've been brought up to think are tender plants who need careful nurturance, unless they're working class women, in which case they should be working all kinds of hours for no pay, virtually, but at least middle class women, women like Alice Paul, should be treated kindly. They're these lovely plants, lovely flowers, and for them to allow these things to be done to them in the spirit of sacrifice in order to get their point across was deeply stirring for more and more people. And so the suffrage movement was growing, their allies were growing in Britain, and Alice Paul decided to go back to Penn and get her PhD, which she did. So once back here, having been brought up in a fairly protected way in a Quaker community that loved her, and then doing this Woodbrook, which was also a somewhat protected place, had by that time, now we're talking around 1910, found herself with a sense of strategy about getting women's suffrage on the agenda for America in a really compelling way, and had a robust self-confidence that she could figure things out, because she was very often the smartest person in the room. And she'd also developed her confidence through the participation in the British suffrage movement of handling her fear. It's not that she ever loved being flamboyant. She wasn't a natural born warrior temperamentally, but she was able to handle her fear of that, so that she was willing to be exemplary when she needed to be. When there wasn't somebody else willing to go out front, she was willing to go out front. And so she joined all in the women's suffrage movement. Didn't go into an academic world, which is what she was suited for in multiple ways, but she decided, no, I'm going to just go on and join fully the women's suffrage movement. Had very little money because she was on allowance still from her parents, who had expected she would be able to support herself. She was able to support herself, but anyway, she decided, I'll just find some place to live in Washington and be part of the center of suffrage activity, which was going after the Senate and the House and trying to get them to pass an amendment. Alice Paul was herself very much of the opinion that the national change needed to happen rather than state by state by state by state. There had been a number of states, there were 9 states by the time she threw herself into this, that had already given the right to vote to women, but she thought, no, it's going to be so hard. We'll be a century getting the right to vote if we go state by state, because there's so many reactionary states on this issue, and especially in the South. And so let's try to get the national amendment that at least forces the issue in many states, and we'll see what happens then. So that was the strategy that she involved that she evolved and came to believe in very strongly, and persuaded a lot of people, and then thought, okay, now we need drama, because I learned in Britain, you need drama in order to get attention and force the issue. So let's have a big parade. And so there had been a leading suffragette in New York, who had done parades in New York that were at first scandalous, and then, oh, well, they're kind of pretty, and okay. So Alice Paul thought, let's try bringing this to Washington. But Washington was not at all ready for this. The women were. She was able to pull 6,000 to 8,000 people, women from around the country, to come to DC for this first national march. And she, I interviewed her. I don't know if I mentioned, did I mention I interviewed her? You know, when she was 75, I was doing my first scholarly paper, actually, that got published as a sociologist, was on the women's suffrage movement, and especially the nonviolent wing of it. And so I needed to interview her because she was the one. And I learned a lot about her just by being able to sit by a fire with her. The first thing she said was, well, you know, George, maybe she called me Mr. Lakey. She was pretty formal. She said, you know, not all species handle the difference of sex in the same way. Now, take, for example, the praying mantis. And I had heard by then that the praying mantis custom was that once the female has received the sperm from the male, she eats the male after sex. Whoa, she's reminding me of the praying mantis. All right, well, that's a signal how this conversation is going to go. But once she had put me in my place, she was actually quite forthcoming. And one of the things that she acknowledged that was so important to her leadership in the women's suffrage movement was, A, to be assertive and not to let men think that they could get over on women, okay? But at B, also to assert something special about women's worldview that was attractive. So it was really important to depart from all the stereotypes that had to do with weakness on the part of women. One of the things that she was actually very critical of the mainstream women's suffrage movement in this country, which was huge, which was getting to be huge at that time. Because what she didn't like about their approach to politicians was they tended to beg for the right to vote on the grounds, you ought to be nice to women and you ought to give us our rights. It was a kind of she felt it was a kind of a begging approach, the lobbying that was being done. And she felt it was, that only confirmed the stereotype that men had of women, of not equal and not assertive, right? So assertiveness was extremely important to her. But on the other hand, she wanted to show that women were bringing something to the table that men were not. The table being the table of power deals and the table of decisions, macro decisions that hugely influence people's lives. And so what she did was made this parade, which she was totally in charge of. It had been our idea, and she was able to be the leader of its implementation, to make this parade gorgeous. So it involved horses, it involved gorgeous costumes, it involved beautifully sewn banners. It was aesthetically delightful. And when I interviewed her, she talked about one of her favorite things to do at the end of a long, hard day at her desk, trying to maneuver and trying to get things done, to just, when the house is settled down, she lived with a whole bunch of women in a big old house that held all these women working together. They were staff and living together at the same time. And she would just go over by herself to the Capitol grounds, and things would be quieted down, and she would look at the demonstration she wanted to have next week, and she would say, okay, so we'll put, let's see, over there we'll put white, lots of white. We'll have a mass of women in white in that part. But over here we'll have gold, and we'll have gold banners, and then we'll have blue. We'll have a big patch of blue over there. And so she gave me the sense of being a kind of painter in politics, who was bringing a kind of soul force from women's sensibility as a part of the to make the movement a matter of pageantry and to add and to heighten the drama. So that first big parade in D.C. had that character to it. It was to be led by a famous woman, a celebrity woman, who was going to be riding a big white horse, and she was all decked in feathers and so on. If you get a chance to see any of those movies or documentaries showing those early days, it was just quite remarkable. So but notice this, talk about assertiveness. She planned the march to be the day before the presidential inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, 2013. So she was going to get there first. She was going to set the tone. Let him have his inauguration parade second, and see how that turned out. So it was quite brilliant, and especially since her parade was so well attended, tons of people came. There was a kerfuffle about race in the parade, as there was a kerfuffle about everything, and there still is, because institutional racism still shows up, right? But racism is nothing now compared with the way how it was in 1913. So there was a big controversy. She had initially reached out to Black women leaders because there was a Black women's suffrage movement as well. And so she reached out to those leaders that really important that you be part of this parade and so on. And yes, great, of course we'll be there. And then she got big pushback from the white part of the movement, because they said, oh, this is terrible. This is going to run down our image and reduce the chance of our getting the suffrage, making the splash we want to make, because it will look bad to have black women there. So she ended up with this kind of irreconcilable thing under the pressure of a march coming up very soon. She ended up simply not taking a position on it, but winking, knowing that Black women would turn out, and they did indeed turn up in that parade eagerly. So the parade took place. It started beautifully. It was gorgeous. It was going down Pennsylvania Avenue. The city authorities didn't want them to use Pennsylvania Avenue. Pennsylvania Avenue is way too good for women to do a march in, and she absolutely insisted and got allies to work on the commissioner, whoever it was, made that decision so that they could walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I mean, at every point, if you can imagine, I see the faces of you. I know a lot of you are organizers. At every point, there was a block of no, you're not good enough. No, you're not equal. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do the other thing. And in my interview, it was just so obvious to me that this was a woman who would not take no for an answer, or it'd be or maybe she would go neutral on something, but she wouldn't actually give up very easily. And she got her Pennsylvania Avenue parade. As it went down the avenue, there was more and more concern being expressed from those watching it among men, and then more and more catcalls, and the catcalls increased in quantity, and then some of the men started pushing past the police who were standing along the street on each side, and along the sidewalks, pushing past them and coming out and hitting the women. And most of the police then turned their backs on whatever it was that was happening, which encouraged, of course, more men to do that, and it became a riot. It became a mob scene. Over 100 women were seriously hurt. The parade almost didn't finish. It was a kind of straggle because so many of the women were pulled out of line. It was really disgusting and horrible. there's a meeting the next day of Alice Paul with the others in the leadership of the women's suffrage movement, to debrief, because they had set that up ahead of time. We'll debrief the parade, right? So she walks in, and with the morning edition of the Washington Post, and says, "Look, we're all over the front page. Look at the photographs. Look at the headlines. We're it." And and they're all sitting there like at a wake, right? They're at a funeral because of this horrible violence that's been unleashed on women the previous day. And she is so excited. And they said, "What are you excited about?" And she said, "Today's the inaugural day. What is Wilson? Who is this new president compared with us? I mean, we we are the headlines. We are the center of political discussion in our country." And that's the main thing that I'll conclude, is because I know you have a lot of questions. No, second to the last thing that I'll conclude with, which is that her her strategic sense, and she relied a lot on early Quakers in the Lamb's War for this, because she had studied that as well. Her strategic sense was the way to win something is to stay on the offensive. Take the offensive through dramatic acts, through the extraordinary, whatever is not, the ho-hum of politics. Do the extraordinary things, create the drama, and keep pushing, pushing, pushing. Always be on the offensive. Never be on the defensive. You're going to lose. Always stay on the offensive. And that was her strategic approach. What that meant then, with regard to Woodrow Wilson, who didn't want women's suffrage, was having to force him to take a public stand in favor of women's suffrage. And that's because the Democrats controlled both houses, both the Senate and the House. So it had the presidency and the whole government, right? So, and she knew that the Democratic South would veto women's suffrage. And the only way to be able to lean on enough of them to be able to swing the vote and make an amendment passage possible was to get Woodrow Wilson to lean on them, because a president has so much weight, so much political weight, right? So she decided he needed to be targeted, and his life be made so difficult by his unwillingness to take a stand for suffrage, that he would switch, lean on the Democratic congressional delegations, and enable them then to vote for suffrage. That was her strategy. It struck so many of the mainstream suffrage movement people, including leaders, as an appalling strategy. The way to persuade politicians is to be nice and to make logical arguments and to point out their interests, are in the long run on our side. We have converging interests, and so on, so on, so on. And so to take what looked to them like a very combative, it was a combative attitude toward elected officials, seemed like exactly the wrong thing to do. Okay, well, then the turning point, this is the last point I'll make, and then we'll have discussion. The turning point was when the World War II was entered by the United States, right? So Woodrow Wilson ran on a platform in 1916 of he kept us out of war, right? So it was Woodrow Wilson, the peace candidate. Now this exact thing was duplicated by LBJ in the 60s. When Barry Goldwater said, "Let's bomb the North Vietnamese," and LBJ was going to bring us peace, right? So, and then he escalated as soon as he was elected. So this is exactly what Woodrow Wilson did. He ran as the man for peace, and then as soon as he was elected, he entered World War I. And so that was the turning point for many popular movements, many social movements. What do we do at that time? In Britain, when Britain got involved in World War I, the women's suffrage movement low-keyed it, took it off the front burner, said, wait a minute, this is a time of national unity, and so on. That's the usual thing that people do when war is declared. And that's what that's largely what the civil rights movement did in this country. That's largely what the labor movement did to some degree. There was a split there. Eugene Debs went to jail in opposition of the First World War, but many labor leaders held back because it was wartime, and there was this huge enthusiasm for the war that they didn't want to buck. Civil rights movement, as I said, held back. It was a kind of, it's what we do. We reformers, we hold back and make war the priority. And that's, and Alice Paul, though, was a Quaker. Was she going to hold back? A, no, because she was a Quaker and she was not going to do anything that suggested support for the war. But B, because the only way to win is to stay on the offensive. And if you let the war take over the agenda, it's goodbye to suffrage for as long as the war goes, which could be a very long war, which it turned out to be. And so that is when she escalated and really put Woodrow Wilson on the hot seat, because what she said was, you're sending our soldiers to Europe to get killed on behalf of democracy, because Wilson was all about democracy, democracy, democracy. And you won't allow democracy to happen here at home. Direct contradiction. There's a Quaker economist, some of you may remember, Kenneth Boulding, who used to say, where there's hypocrisy, there's hope. If you want to change somebody's mind, it's way easier if they're hypocritical, because then they are at least split. Whereas if they're just utterly cynical and say, oh, I like poor people to be poor, it's good for them, then you don't really have much hope for that person. So where there's hypocrisy, there's hope, said Kenneth Boulding. Well, that was also the view of Alice Paul. She said, it's the very fact that he's amplifying his democracy rhetoric that makes him more vulnerable to us. And now we will do what it takes. So she, for the first time in American history, picketed the White House and held up in the picket signs Woodrow Wilson's own words that he was saying about democracy, and saying, if you believe in democracy, then you'll permit women to vote. And so they did that for a while, and then anything that you do for a while gets boring and no longer is drama, right? And she understood. She was not a dramatic personality, but she understood drama. So the next step was to create urns, and so they had urns on the White House front steps, on the sidewalk in front of the White House. They had urns always burning, so the latest of Woodrow Wilson's speeches could be burned if the speech had to do with democracy, which it always did. So they were constantly consigning to the flames Woodrow Wilson's words about democracy. So they were mobbed. They were mobbed over and over. Again, police staying away so that the people could beat up these women who were at the shrine of the White House, which should always be respected, should never picket the White House, and you should certainly not say anything against the wartime president. And then the police, thank goodness, started arresting the women instead of allowing them simply to be beaten up, and because it seemed at least a little safer to be in a cell. But then once they were in actually deplorable conditions in the jailhouse, in just outside DC, the Occoquan prison, they started, Alice Paul had them start hunger strikes. She had experienced it in Britain, found it was effective there, and decided to do it here. And so that combination of pressures moved Wilson from, no, suffrage is not on my agenda, to, oh, suffrage, yes. Well, suffrage for women, that's a good idea. Let's discuss it after the war. First things first. To, oh, okay, well, we can discuss it a little bit, but let's keep our eye on the ball, which is the war. To, as part of the struggle for democracy in the world, we need to free our women and allow them to vote, and so on and so on. And so they turned Woodrow Wilson around. He, in turn, liberated the Democrats to vote for, the Republicans were already very pro-suffrage, but it was the Democrats who were the problem, and they needed to be turned, and they were turned, and they actually got by, I think, about one vote. It was an extremely close vote, but they were able to get the amendment through. So that was by talking very fast, sharing an awful lot of information. But I'm so curious about what your questions might be about Alice Paul's leadership and anything else.
George, can you talk about?
George, this is Stephanie.
Ah.
Wait a minute. So my image of this parade was erroneous. I thought that it was the day after Wilson's inauguration. Not true. And I certainly didn't hear about any violence. So my image is that the parade upstaged Woodrow Wilson. So thank you for telling the whole story, or, I'm sure shortened, but that was.
Think how disappointed he was to arrive at Union Station. You've probably been in Union Station in DC. It's so enormous, right? And it's a grand kind of palace place, right? And he expected to get off the train. He'd come down from Princeton, where he'd been president of Princeton, right? So he comes down on the train. I'm not sure he came from Princeton, but anyway, he came in on the train expecting there to be this big crowd of well-wishers. He's so exciting. Tomorrow you're going to be inaugurated. Yay! He came in the day before, right? He comes into an empty station because everybody's out watching the parade. That's exactly when he should have known. Life will be much easier for me if I will just support suffrage from the beginning.
I think Wilson was probably the governor of New Jersey at that point.
Oh,
right before
okay.
he became president.
Okay, thank you.
George, can you talk about what Alice's career was like after the amendment got passed?
Yes. Well, of course, then the big question was, where do we go from here? And she had reached out a lot to pacifists. And so there was a lot of women in that suffrage movement who were pacifists. There were a lot of socialist women in the movement. There were, of course, people working against racism and so on. So that movement pretty much, and there were a lot of women who thought, now that we have the vote, we have to make sure that we are an educated electorate. And so the League of Women Voters, for example, was started. So it was a period of a lot of women organizing this and that and the other thing that represented other core beliefs, some of which they set aside a little bit, thinking suffrage first, then we can be more effective pacifists against the war. Suffrage first, then we can be more effective in this or that, right? And so the big question was, what was she going to do? Well, she thought, look, this is only us getting through the gates and into the big time. But what about the many, many other ways in which women are not equal? Many, many ways. So now we have the right to vote, but we're still, every time we turn around, there's something against us. So let's create an equal rights amendment and another amendment to the Constitution that establishes our equality in all areas, social equality as well as equality at the ballot box. So she had called the right to vote amendment the Susan B. Anthony amendment, and this was to be the Equal Rights Amendment. And that's what she spent the whole rest of her life working on, the Equal Rights Amendment, which, as you know, came very close to winning not many years ago, and hopefully will be revived and so on. I could just add that one of the tensions, always movements have tensions, right? And so one of the tensions within that, her movement was, because there were people who felt so strongly about the war, so strongly about race and other issues, there was a lot of pressure on her always to turn the organization she created into a multi-issue kind of comprehensively revolutionary movement, that would deal with class and race and so on. And she always resisted that. So even though she was a Quaker pacifist, she was not willing to publicly come out against the war, because she said, no, I've been really, really strict on this. So many of you want us to take a position on a whole menu of things. And I've always said, no, 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 because then we'll split. There'll be, well, it's fine for my issue, but actually I don't like your issue, and so on. And so the only way that we can achieve the unity that we need in order to win women's suffrage is to make it a one-plank campaign. So she never, she herself knew how limited, in a certain way, the suffrage is. Okay, you get the right to vote, it still leaves so much else out there. And she said, but we won't get the right to vote if we try to incorporate within our movement everything else. Because the country's not ready for, I don't know that she ever said this, the country's not ready for revolution, but it's obvious to me, the bit of history that I know about that period, the country was not ready, and maybe still isn't, for a comprehensive revolution that would deal with all the sources of oppression that now exist and that existed then.
Hey, George?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can tell us about the role that religion played in the suffragette movement. I'm thinking of the civil rights movement and just how prominent, the Christian faith and different leaders were in that movement. And I don't know anything about the suffragette movement, other than I know you mentioned, personally, she was a Quaker and appears to be faithful to Quaker testimonies. But I'm not sure what role the actual religion in general, if there were other faiths, or did they pray together? Was there a movement through religious groups to support the suffragette movement?
No, it was not. It was not a movement that really reflected a lot of claimed religion. Of course, there were plenty of people of faith in it, but it was not. They didn't create a culture of acceptance. Nothing like the civil rights movement, and I think it's because of the base of the civil rights movement was so strongly in the Black church. That was the institutional structure in the South where Black people had at least some degree of autonomy, right? I mean, almost every other area of life in the Deep South, Black people were under the control of others, but their church at least had enough autonomy so that they could, so that ministers could feel like they had the latitude, and sometimes they just didn't, but sometimes they did have the latitude to be able to step out and not pay hard consequences immediately. So that, I think, was an accident of the civil rights movement, that people could do it that way. And also, there wasn't, among the leadership of the women's suffrage movement, I don't think there was that much overlap in terms of religious expression.
I just want to jump in on that. I mean, I think one of the things that also has to do is what is the narrative or the freedom story of of the church or your religious group. And so for sure in the Black church, there was a very strong freedom story, right? And around a lot of power held there, but there not a whole lot of religions I'm aware of that held a strong freedom story for women. And so, and I think it's actually remarkable that so many of the women leaders, or I don't know about so many, but a number of women leaders that we've heard of are Quaker. And to me, that does feel connected, at least in my experience of Quakerism, as a place that has a very strong freedom story or liberation story or belief that if we all have God in us, women do too. So that's a part of our story of equality. And so to me, it doesn't feel like a mistake at all, or a surprise or coincidence that there's such strong women leaders who are Quaker, but that there weren't other religious groups that had a strong attachment or stated leadership institutionally to the.
There's a new book in the library, which I can't remember the title of, but it's about the role of spiritualism in that time of history in the United States, and the effect and influence it had on women becoming accepted as speakers and people to listen to. And I found it fascinating because I grew up with a mother who was born in 1903, and she was more affected by that than I realized until I read that book and saw where it had come from and how prevalent it was at the time she grew up. And women had been, as George was saying, had been described as fragile and not able to handle being in the public eye and so on. And one of the ways they made it into that position was through becoming a spiritualist channels, so that they would be speaking with a spirit coming through when they made public speeches.
Interesting.
And I found that very interesting, how that was woven in, and that some Quakers moved into that and followed it, but a lot of Quakers did not. But there was a lot of cross communication and a relationship there.
Hi, this is Demi. I've been listening. I have another deadline, so I've been listening without video, and this is great, and glad you're doing this, George. I just wanted to say that our sons went to Westfield Friends School, and I had always heard that Alice Paul was buried in the burial ground of Westfield Friends. And so I asked the then head of school, Bill Probsting, and he said, yes, I know where it is. And it's a very old burial ground. There are many, many, many simple, really simple Quaker headstones. And there's grass growing around a lot of them, so you kind of have to burrow and find the names. But kind of out there in the middle of nowhere is Alice Paul. And I said, Bill, oh my God, this is terrible. I mean, she's one of the most important women in American history. What's up? He said, well, what I was always understood was her family did not like what she was doing. They thought she was too radical, and they were not going to pay for anything special. So I just want to get that off of my chest, because she's sitting over there at Westfield meeting burial ground, or sitting, lying, whatever she's doing. And I don't know if that's just the way it's always going to be. I mean, maybe in the future, we could drum up a project. I don't know. I'll also just say that we lived at Taylor's Farm, as some of you know, for many years. And May Taylor, we went there first because May Taylor was born in 1888. We lived in a big farmhouse, and it was hers, and we helped her get wood, and she lived on one side, and we lived on the other. And as I was learning more about Alice Paul when I was younger, and reading a lot about her, I realized she was about the same age as May Taylor. Maybe it's crackly. and she must have known her. And they both grew up in Moorestown. Actually, I've driven by Alice Paul's house. And I said, May, I've just been reading all about Alice Paul. Did you know her? May was like, May, she's so famous. What do you mean famous? No, she's not famous. I said, May, she's famous. Anyway, finally May, got rid of her frown and said, well, I'm sorry. I know this isn't good, but she was a Hicksite, and May's family were Orthodox. And May told us that she was raised in Moorestown, as was Alice Paul, just outside of Moorestown, that May was raised that if she was walking down the street and saw a Hicksite coming down, say, the sidewalk in the same direction, she was taught, you cross over the street and go to the sidewalk on the opposite side. So anyway, Alice's family were Hicksites, and
They still thought she was too radical.
they still thought she was too radical. Certainly made it. So anyway.
Thanks. Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
bit of history. And I don't know if I don't know. I mean, just quickly, I don't want to take people's time, but I mean, I can't do anything right now, but in the future, should we just let Alice, let the grass grow even more around her little tiny stone until no one could ever find it? I don't know.
Well, there is, thank goodness, the home she grew up in has been turned
Right.
into a museum. Yes. So in that way, it's
Right.
a more lively way of honoring than the gravesite itself. But the larger question you're raising is the opinion of her, at the time, right? And when she came back from Britain, she immediately went to a bunch of different Quaker meetings to tell about, what had happened with her and the importance of suffrage and so on, and her report from Woodbrook experience and so on and so on. And she kept finding herself needing to appeal to early friends as the example, and I don't know if she talked about Lucretia Mott or not, but early friends anyway, because early friends were actually very aggressive, right? They were they thought they were fighting the Lamb's War. They used that 3-letter word war in order to try to discharacterize what warriors they were for God. And so she was out of sync with cultural Quakerism at the time. And then, of course, there was the Hicksite question as well. And we have to remember Lucretia Mott was not, she was a controversial figure in our meeting at the time.
Right.
Now everybody loves Lucretia Mott, right? But at the time, and I think we have to understand that outliers in any group, even Quakers, have that tendency to put some distance from the outliers. I remember some of you know that I was on the Phoenix sailing ship that went to Vietnam with medical supplies in violation of U.S. law. And it was hugely controversial at the time among friends. We did it. And then I think it was only 5 years later, down at 4th and Arch, there was a big blown up photograph of the Phoenix and a caption underneath describing the glorious voyage. And the tour guides at 4th and Arch were told to brag about the Phoenix. Yay, Quakers were right in there in the forefront of the opposition to the Vietnam War, and aren't we amazing, and stuff like that. And our meeting was very supportive to me. So there's the wider Quaker thing, but then there's our very own meeting. I went through clearness and so on, and the meeting, recognizing that I might not come back alive, agreed to take care of my family should I not return. It's a very, very moving chapter in my own history with our meetings. So I'm not saying all meetings, have this problem or something like that, but it is very, very human, I think, for collectivities to more honor the people in the center than to
Right,
honor the periphery. Yeah.
right, for sure. For sure. And it is, I just looked up, it's the Alice Paul Foundation or the Alice Paul Institute that bought her home Paulsdale in just in Moorestown. And they not only have like a museum in the house, but for quite a while I was on the mailing list. They tried to use the house as a place for trainings for girls, in leadership. And they got, once the wife of the governor of New Jersey to come and be there. So some people have really been trying to continue her legacy that way.
Great. Thank you, Demi.
Yeah, this is Stephanie. That's right. They have a staff. I mean, I don't know if they've all been furloughed. Wait a minute. Yeah. Westfield Friends School came and did a whole program on with the Westfield students on Alice Paul at Paulsdale. So I myself think that's a better legacy than a grave.
I could just another Quaker note in relation to this. In this book, Alice Paul, which is now regarded, I think, as the most detailed and standard biography of her. The authors state their belief that she was sufficiently a person of faith so that her spirit survived those long ordeals in prison with all the force feeding that went with it and so on, in ways that maybe people who didn't have a background in quiet waiting, and the lively spiritual life that Quakers are supported to have, that maybe somebody without that would have a harder time standing up to the rigors of long periods of time, isolation, very often isolation, solitary, that kind of thing. Yeah, maybe there are other questions. And
George,
Well, just one more thing about that book. Did you say anything, George, about the book and how it was written? Anyway, Margaret Bacon, I just want to salute Margaret Bacon, because Amelia Fry, who's the second author, Margaret really worked with her and encouraged her. And Amelia Fry's passed away, but I was kind of keeping track of what Amelia Fry was getting access to incredible information about Alice Paul that no one else could get. But she was also, she was taking huge amounts of time tracking down one detail, and Margaret was getting more and more nervous. And then Amelia Fry began to have a lot of memory issues, and Margaret was panicking. And then I think Margaret helped transition to this other author who, thank God, was able to take this information that no one else had and finish whatever the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
George, you were addressing her inner strength, and I was just caught by when you said she wasn't a natural warrior, and she, did anyway get up on the block on, in England, and I just wonder, the things I've seen about this time when the policemen turned their back. And let the crowd hurt the women, or what happened at the White House gates. If you have any more thoughts on her knowledge of what the power structures were going to do, how they were going to respond, and then the inner strength that just kept her planning, it sounds like, planning and moving on.
Well, she was very inspired by the British. It was handy the British were going first, right? And so, and because she was able to enter a movement that was already alive with brilliant leadership and so on, And because maybe a women's movement is more likely than a men's movement to actually take care of each other. So, rather than just bravado, charge the troops or something like that. But anyway, her introduction in Britain was probably formative for her, that she was able to be frightened, do something, debrief, make sense of it, do another something, be frightened, and so on, and learn to live with the reality that it's very frightening to go into combat, even for nonviolent soldiers. Maybe some people might find it more difficult because some people feel a gun is some protection, or feel braver with a gun. But the fact that nonviolent soldiers don't go into battle with guns means that the chance of getting hurt, I've always felt, when I was involved in the civil rights movement, I was beaten up by police, and I just figured, well, that's what goes on here. So it's pretty handy to that she was in Britain. It was a historical accident that was really marvelous for her. And also going through the forced feeding experience in Britain, and then doing it in the US. She did it with full knowledge of how hard it would be. She also, her style of leadership was highly directive. She was not a facilitative kind of person. She was very, very hard-headed and directive, and maybe a control freak, actually. So she and that kind of leadership often goes with somebody willing to be exemplary. That is, to be out there in front and be the first ones to take it. So if she was in that prison outside DC, when she decided now's the time for us to do hunger striking, she was the first. And then the word quickly spread, of course, informally through by then sympathetic jail staff, who were being won over. These women who were taking care of, who were hired by the prison and were taking care of these prisoners. Maybe they were hardened in some ways, but they were moved by these fellow women going through what they were going through, and voluntarily. And so the word spread very quickly. So the other women who were being held in solitary also, okay, Alice is refusing food, we will refuse food. So Alice was very aware that all these dynamics, what would unfold, and was also aware that it was going to take a particular toll on her, because she had tremendous sort of physical resistance to the force feeding process. And it was extremely painful, therefore. So she went in with a lot of foreknowledge, and that was a great support to her. And it's we now do trainings in order to support people to do that, right? The civil rights movement made a big breakthrough in relying on trainings for people to engage in nonviolent action, knowing what they might be in for. But this was pre-civil rights movement, so they didn't do trainings, but they just talked a lot with each other. And then there was great support too in that big house, which I was where I interviewed her, and it just had all these rooms. It was an old mansion that a friend of Alice Paul's in New York City had married 3 millionaires in a row. The first 2 died, and then she married a 3rd millionaire. She just had this great openness to falling in love with millionaires, and so she decided, well, I'm done with marrying millionaires. And she had this huge pile of money and loved Alice Paul, and bought Alice this mansion, which is very close to FCNL on Capitol Hill. And so, and Alice Paul, another, I think, aspect of her Quaker testimonies is that she always lived very modestly. So even when this multimillionaire said, oh, okay, I'll buy you a mansion, she took a small room, not a large room, bedroom, and so on and so on. So it was always in that spirit of discipline, self-discipline, acceptance of maybe austerity is too hard a word, but simplicity, in order to be able to keep the struggle in the forefront of her mind. and her heart. Yeah.
George, what does women at that time? It seems like we have two meeting houses within our meeting house, and my understanding is that somehow the men and the women would split up for the yearly meeting, and I was never clear on what was going on there. Can you say something about that? Does it relate to the context that Alice Paul was working in?
Well, one interpretation I've read of the early practice in George Fox's day of having separate gendered meetings is that it supported the women to be able to make decisions and speak their minds and be assertive and so on. You know, because that would be a whole strange new world for women in 17th century England to make decisions together with no women, no men telling them what to do. And that having separate meetings, this is the interpretation I remember reading when I was looking into this, is that Fox understood, he being by then married to a very strong woman, Margaret Fox, right? That it would be, it could be tough for women to make those decisions, to be fully participating in a meeting for business when men were there. And so having two meetings, making decisions, and with somewhat different agendas, right? Women had some things to care for, men had other things to care for, but nevertheless, what it did was gave women the practice of speaking up and of asserting leadership, because the women's meeting had to have a clerk and a recording clerk and so on. So that, so Alice Paul, so that's way later than when Alice Paul comes along and sees Quaker women so assertive and so okay with speaking out and taking charge and running things. And so she was so used to that in the Quaker world, and it heightened the contradiction between the Quaker world and the regular world outside, where women were still highly intimidated by and large.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the, let's see, yeah. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the race issues and Alice Paul's view of the later civil rights movement and voting rights issues for Black women, Black communities. You talked a little bit about it, about the race issues early on in the women's suffrage movement, around the 1916 demonstration and so forth, but what about later?
It's a great question. I'm glad you raised it. In fact, it was raised during the chat after meeting this morning. So, yes, Alice Paul's situation was so tough because racism, of course, was so thick. And it was largely white women who were who were saying yes to her invitation. Let's create a new part of the larger women's scene in which we get to take the offensive and really go after them. And so her inclination, supported by her Quakerism, was, of course, Black women should participate. And the Black woman suffrage movement that there was in the Black community of largely middle-class and upper middle-class professional Black women should be in on all of this. So her inclination was always to invite them to the party, whatever the party happened to be. And then she would get pushback from racists within her own circle saying, no, no, no. So she became circumspect about that because she didn't want to split her movement over it. And on the other hand, every chance she got, she would make room for, and sometimes that would be through inviting a Black woman leader to address a convention, for example. So they would have these annual meetings, right? So at an annual meeting, you have a lot of guest speakers. So you get the black woman guest speaker. Well, now, for our eyes, that's tokenism, right? For those days, that was brave. So we're talking about a very different historical context that she was always wrestling with and trying to make sense of in a way that that would work. So she, at first she thought, well, in that big parade, she thought, well, maybe we could just put out the word, black women come to the suffrage parade, and then just as they're arriving, steer them toward the back. And then they would be the back of the parade. Maybe that would work. And then there was pushback to that. Wait a minute, from women more willing to take chances, her friends, who said, wait a minute, that's like segregation to put them in the back. So they have to be invited to join whatever subunit of the parade makes sense to them. For example, Alice, you and I are going to be in a college women's section of the parade. So black, graduates of or attenders at colleges should join our section, right? And oh, yes, of course, right. So okay, good. We can get away with that. So she was constantly in this mode of trying to keep the thing together while dealing with a degree of racism that you and I have never seen. I mean, it was just so thick on the ground. The assumptions were just so thick on the ground. Now, I've heard it said, in fact, I think it was said after meeting, that the white women's suffrage movement was not interested, was against black women voting. And that is a way oversimplifying statement. What they were for was black women voting wherever black people could vote, which is the North, right? So so as far as I know, no black women in the North since 1920 have complained about having the right to vote. And they wouldn't have had the right to vote. Those black women in Philadelphia would not have had the right to vote if it had not been gotten by the amendment. And the amendment would not have passed if the language of the amendment was inclusive, race inclusive. In other words, she designed that amendment to be carefully, to leave race out of the equation, because that was the only way to get the amendment passed. So it's just women, and we won't talk about what kinds. Women will be allowed to vote, right? So if she had, and there were people saying, no, we have to be sure that black women could vote, which implies that, well, then black women in the South would be able to vote. But women in the South would not have been able to vote. Black men couldn't vote either. In the South, no black, right? I mean, there were some residuals left after the post-World War II, the post-Civil War, that thing, that's, what was that called? The movement to end slavery and restore and put citizenship. What was that period?
The Reconstruction?
Reconstruction, right. There were still some few black men voting because of Reconstruction that lived long enough to be voting post 1900, but not many. So most black men couldn't vote in the South. Most black women couldn't vote in the South. There's no way that the South would allow black women to vote and not black men. So it was irrelevant, really. What was relevant was, would there be women's suffrage that would at least allow black women in the North to vote? And that's what was accomplished. So we have to remember, it wasn't until 1965 that black men could vote in the South, aside from those old codgers. So that's I think do you think women would have waited until 1965 to get the right to vote in the United States? by saying, you know, that's how resistant the South was. Not until 1965 did Black men get the right to vote in the South. So I don't get the criticism of Alice Paul and the rest for setting things up that way. It was the only way that white women could vote everywhere and Black women could vote in the North. And that was a phenomenal gain over what had preceded. Actually, come to think of it, I don't know if we would have even gotten the right to vote for Black people in the South in 1965, because the women electorate, the electorate of women in America has by and large been more progressive than the men, right? I mean, over and over, there's that gender gap that keeps showing up. Women voters tend to be more pro-peace than men. Women in the electorate tend to be more pro all kinds of progressive things than men. So maybe we wouldn't even had the right to vote for Black people in the South by 1965. I don't know. The resistance has been amazing, and we still see it today.
Women are much more pro-environment. So
Yes.
it's something like 70 to 40, something like that.
Amazing.
Or even higher. I don't know, maybe 80 to 40. It's been there all along. So it's very interesting, and a lot of theories about it, but don't really know what they are. You know, I mean, I have no conclusions of my own. I think it's related to the resistance to change, and a person's resistance to give up control or give up power or give up ownership of land, or, you know, I think it's tied to the history and the pattern of ownership and control, and feeling that I need to be in charge. You know, men have more of a feeling that I have to be in charge, I have to be in control, I have to provide consistency. So there's more of a tie to the past, I think.
I think that the other thing I just want to note, because I was thinking about this, I think it was Kate at the end of worship who
That's right.
jumped in. And what was interesting to me was the assumption that if we're talking about suffragettes, we're talking about white people, white women, as opposed to the very many Black women who actually fought for women's suffrage. And so I think there's just all of the ways that we hear something and attach all kinds of assumptions to it. And when there's way more of there's a way fuller picture than in our first reactions. And so I was actually kind of appreciating that moment of to sort of slow it down a little bit. And there's also lots to be deeply upset about and distrustful about the way that we talk about our history and who gets left out, and that all of us could name white women suffragettes, and how many of us could name, 5 Black women suffragettes. So I want to hold that reality also.
Here's one name to remember: Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell is an amazing Black woman leader who who was the primary leader of the Black women's suffragette movement at that time. Mary Church Terrell.
Wonderful name.
Isn't it?
It might also be worth raising up the fact that Susan B. Anthony was quite the racist.
That's right. Yeah.
What were some of the things that Alice Paul was especially involved with during her later decades. You said that she continued to work for the Equal Rights Amendment, but I remember growing up, I didn't really notice her name until I was, I guess, sometime in college, and I was aware that, I became aware of her then. But I don't know exactly what her activities were, what her passions were in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Well, nobody does that I know, because she was an amazingly focused person. Amazingly focused person. So when she latched onto the ERA as the Equal Rights Amendment as the thing, as her next project, that was it. That was it. She was also extraordinarily non-self-promotional. So a lot of people having done what she did, and she was all over the front pages in the, during the struggle for women's suffrage, she was also non-promotional and constantly pushing other people out front, constantly, the headliners in the speeches and the conventions and so on. She'd always push other women out front, but she was always controlling everything. And so any smart journalist would figure that out. And, and so her name did show up a lot. But usually you should try to get other people's names and the profiles, and journalists want profiles of people and stuff. She didn't want profiles of herself. She was very emphatic, not telling private information about her personal life. There's a wonderful movie I recommend called Iron-Jawed Angels. An HBO movie, very well made and extraordinarily accurate, except for one thing. They made up a love interest in order to make it a more, family loving film or something. So they make up this guy who's a journalist and falls in love with her and stuff like that. So there's this whole back and forth of that. And it's all hokum. It's HBO's invention, but everything else, because there's no record of her having a love relationship at all. And she burned all her personal correspondence before she died. So she was a very determined person to keep the cards close. So the New Yorker never did a profile. And there's every reason why you would never have heard of her. She was just fine with us never ever having heard of her. And that's pretty remarkable too.
Georgia, this is Reba. One more comment. I just want to thank you for kind of redeeming the word drama for me. Of course, in our current political conversation and the latest headline, but I do appreciate that bent, if I had it correct, of her being able to seize the moment and knowing that that was important. I think that's the first time I've actually really understood that. And how things that are colorful or meaningful. I am struck in the comparison, especially after your last comment, how much depth she had. So drama without depth gets us one thing.
Not naming names.
But actually that gives me a quite different perspective on it. And in a little bit of forward movement that I know about, like in the LGBT community, her ability to sort of see what would work without compromising, the neutral comments that you said, that she wouldn't say anything, really gave me some things to learn from, I think. If you maybe not using military language too much, but leaving the battle for another day. That is a very difficult thing to struggle with internally, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that, Reba. Yeah. Gandhi learned something from the women's suffrage movement, which is pretty amazing cultural leap, right? He's very culturally, very, very distant, but he was fascinated with technology of struggle. And so he paid attention to the women's suffrage movement. And one of the things he picked up was the drama. And so in 1931, when he decided to inaugurate a major, or 30, I guess it was, an all-out Indian insurrection, nonviolent insurrection against the British Empire, he decided the first act would be making salt, because there was a salt monopoly that the British Empire benefited enormously from. All salt, anybody who likes salt in their food and who doesn't had to pay, had to buy it it was more expensive because it included a tax that the British Empire collected. And so he thought that would be a good one because it would be affecting common people everywhere. Everybody would get that. So, okay, so he figured, well, we'll just grab some of the salt from the sea and dry it, and and then consume it, and that'll be our civil disobedience. Okay, so he could have just gone to the sea and said, ta-da, ta-da, journalists all come and watch me. No, what does he do? He does something like a 20-day march to the sea. So the tension is building, for 20 days, right through towns and villages, and the parade, the march is getting larger and larger. And what's he gonna do? What's he gonna do? He's gonna make salt. What? He's gonna make salt. Oh, I wanna join. And more people, closer and closer, the drum beat is getting louder. The newspapers are every day, bigger headlines. They're going to the sea. Now they're almost to the sea. Oh my gosh, they're at the sea, they're doing it. Talk about, right? The guy was a ham, it turned out. So it was women who gave permission to Gandhi to do some of the brilliant stuff that he did.
So, George, I don't know if you said this, but if people are interested, there's did you mention the movie Iron Jawed Angels?
Mm.
You did. Okay, sorry. And the movie Suffragette with Meryl Streep about Emmeline Pankhurst.
Mm-hmm. No, I didn't mention that. Thank you.
Okay.
Say it again.
So it's called Suffragette, and Meryl Streep stars as Emmeline Pankhurst. And of course, as George said, the Alice Paul was hugely, hugely influenced by the Pankhursts. That they changed the course of her life, right, George?
Right.
Yeah. So I was really happy. I think the movie, it's a couple years old, but I'm sure it's easy to get. And Iron Jawed Angels, I don't know if it has a lot of the facts. It introduces, it's with Hilary Swank as Alice Paul. It introduces one concession to popular film in that there's a potential little love interest for Alice Paul. Oh, you did. I'm sorry. Oh, shut up. Okay, sorry.
But otherwise, it's quite good. Yes. Iron Jawed Angels. I liked it a lot. I showed it every semester at Swarthmore College. Every semester I showed it to the students. And I think it's ironical at Swarthmore because for 7 years I was there, and I was always remarking on it, that they have a dorm named for Alice Paul. So everybody knows that Alice Paul went there, right? But they don't have a dorm named Lucretia Mott. And Lucretia Mott, our meeting member, was one of the founders of Swarthmore College and was one of the people who insisted it be co-ed. And then the state of Pennsylvania had a law against boards of directors being both sexes, both genders. You could only have male boards of directors of colleges in those days. So the state legislature had to change the law in order to let Lucretia Mott be on the first board of trustees of Swarthmore College. Anyway, so I'll bet most of my students never heard of Lucretia Mott. but they all knew about Alice Paul. So we watched Iron Jawed Angels every semester.
George, this is really information and food for thoughts, and it comes up for me again, the same kind of dialogues about how we can win, and I struggle with this tension between the need for equality systemically and choosing strategies that are very focused and succeed, and yet the structure still stays very unequal. So the idea that, yes, we got the vote and we still don't have an equal rights amendment, we still don't have all lives equally valued, and it's hard for me to celebrate each strategy that succeeds in a very focused way and also be aware of the systemic dominance that continues. And it makes me think, well, why would women be on the forefront of the things we're on the forefront of, being more voters, being more environmentalist? I think it's this connectedness with not being identified with dominance. We may be married to it, but we're not identifying as. There's a relational thing to the whole that continues to break my heart as the whole continues, even with these focused successes. And I don't know, it's just where I'm at, always hovering. And can you speak to that some more? You have before when I've asked about it.
Well, I might be able to offer you a little hope there. Because there are examples of, and the ones I know best are in the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, where people did single issue campaigns, right, of the kind that don't change the structure, right? But they built those campaigns in such an empowering way for the individuals in them that they were able to tackle bigger and bigger objectives. And they also, and this is a very important piece that's very often missing in our country, they also added a vision element, so that these campaigns they were going after specific goals, true, not the whole thing, right? But they were also developing a vision that would show what the new system would look like if they did get rid of the old system, if they went beyond the single issue campaigns to actually change the system. So that whetted people's appetites. So instead of, okay, we won what we can win, now let's go back to life as usual, right? It was instead, well, wait a minute, what I've learned through participating in this campaign is that we could have a whole lot more. It could be amazing if we really made the big change, but we also notice there's an economic elite that's at the gate that's not allowing us to make the big change. So, but wait a minute, we've learned in this campaign how to do this, in that campaign how to do that. What if the campaigns next door also latched onto this vision, and we were to have multiple movements working together to the scale that we could take on the economic elite guarding the gate and push them aside, then we could have a new system. And the hope part of that is that that's what the Nordics did. So they were able to push the economic elite out of the way, invent a new system, and the new system is now, what, half a century of outperforming our system. So it was a tremendous breakthrough in terms of, it's not utopia. They're the first to say it's not utopia. So there may not even be utopia, I don't know, but someday, I don't know, I don't think so. But it feels utopian to go over there and experience it, to see what women's lives are like there, what children's lives are like there, to live in a place where there's not poverty, for example, for a Philadelphian to go to the capital city, the largest city in Norway, or, you know, and, hey, where's the poverty? What? You know, and they say, well, poverty's so 19th century. We decided we'd give that up. And so they did. But they couldn't have given it up if they hadn't been able to take care of that obstacle that was guarding the gate. And they wouldn't have gotten to that point of going after the obstacle if they didn't have the confidence and the sense of solidarity that would enable them to go through the downside of a struggle, right? The downside of a struggle is all that shit that's dumped on you, right? And so they were willing, because they believed in each other, they'd been in struggle together, and they'd gotten something, so they believed they were competent, they had capacity. Then they thought, well, okay, if more and more of us are going to have each other's back, and if we have a vision that gives us confidence we could have something actually better, then we've got the ingredients for the big O, the big thing that Berta wants. And so they can have the Berta movement that wins.
George, that sounds like the Green New Deal.
It's a big step in that direction of putting multiple things together. It's a big step toward vision. Yes. Yes.
George, that sounds like the Green New Deal to me, and Bernie Sanders' programs and policies that he's working toward. And there's a huge movement moving. I think we need to, well, say this. I think going deeper into the spirit would lead us into magnifying our confidence and our clarity on the need for the wholeness on the bottom line.
And very often that's what we find in leadership, right? That leaders are very often people who have spent their time in the wilderness like Jesus or whatever, you know, have gone through the spiritual development that enables them to stay at it decade in and decade out. Can't wait for everybody in the movement to go through that, though, and everybody doesn't need to, based on based on the Nordic experience. It's not that everybody was in spiritual retreat; it's that everybody, so many people participated in those movements and experienced in that way the solidarity. I mean, that's such a huge thing. What do children do when they're scared? They reach out for a hand to hold, right? And the reason the keepers of the gates are still there is because they scare us into submission over and over and over again. When my dad had his first job in a textile mill, a couple of the workers turned out to be labor organizers, and management found out that that's what they were there to do. So they fired them, and then on the roof facing the big assembly yard where all the workers would assemble and wait for the whistle to blow and then go in, on that roof they put a machine gun facing the yard where my dad and the fellow workers were going to wait every morning to go in. It's always been that way, Rita. They scare us into submission. It's sometimes more subtle, but there it is. And troops do get called out in the United States. Troops will even shoot students at Kent State, right? That is the kind of economic elite we have that is willing to use troops against us if we threaten their guardianship at the gates. And so we do need to, I mean, in living experience, people have been gunned down. We need to find the solidarity that enables us to take that on. And that solidarity exists. Some of it's manifesting right now during the coronavirus experience that we're going through. That solidarity exists in principle. What we need to do is support it and harness it. Bill McKibben told me that he's often asked when he finishes speaking, somebody comes up to him and says, well, Bill, okay, I'm convinced now climate is hugely important and we ought to do something about it. So what can I do as an individual about climate? And Bill says, well, first, stop being an individual. So Bill knows what we know. It's in solidarity, it's in community. We experience it at meeting. It's in community that we find the solidarity that we need. And then we can take stuff on. But it does need vision. Because if we don't know what we're for and just keep on being against something, then of course, our chances are not very great to get something better. Steve, I'm guessing that we've probably explored enough dimensions of this for today, although it's not that I'm eager to stop because this is my life. I love it. But on the other hand,
Well, it is 2:45. I don't want to step on anybody else who wants to have some last thing to say, but I think it's time to wrap up soon anyway.
I just want to say thank you, George. I'm going to get going now. I have another Zoom meeting starting soon. It was very nice to hear from you and also to hear from others in discussing this topic. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Mona speaks my mind. Thank you, George.
You're so welcome.
Thank you, George.
You're so welcome. Love you all. So grateful to be in our meeting.
Oh, thank you, George.
Take care. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, George.
Bye, and thank you.
Thanks, George.
It's rare that I've gotten so much kitchen cleaning done because I was listening so intently. Thank you.
What was rare?
Bye, Rita.
Bye. See you in the next Zoom.